Atlantis. Just the name makes you think of this incredible, shining civilization that just vanished into the sea. It's a legend that's fascinated people for thousands of years, and it all started with one guy, the philosopher Plato. So let's get into it. What did he and the other great thinkers of his time really believe about this lost empire? Everything kicks off with this single line. When Plato wrote about Atlantis, he called its story strange but perfectly true. And without one phrase, he basically started a debate that's been going on for over 2,000 years. Was he just recording a lost piece of history, or was he cooking up some kind of philosophical fable? The answer, as it turns out, is way more interesting than you might think.
So let's do a quick recap of the story Plato actually told. He talks about this huge naval power way out in the Atlantic, past what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. This empire, Atlantis, was ridiculously rich and powerful, supposedly ruled by the half-god children of Poseidon. But you know how these things go. With all that power, they got arrogant. They started an unjust war against a really old, noble version of Athens. And because of that hubris, the gods turned on them. And in just one terrible day and night of earthquakes and floods, the entire island of Atlantis just disappeared. Gone.
Okay, so if you want to figure out what to make of a story from Plato, who's the number one person you'd ask? Well, it's got to be his most brilliant and, let's be honest, often his most critical student, Aristotle. His opinion should be the key to all this, but this is where the mystery really gets going. For hundreds of years, the common answer to that question has been a pretty firm yes. The standard story is that Aristotle, ever the practical guy, looked at his teacher's tale and just said, "Nope, made up, pure invention." But is that what really happened? Let's take a look. And here's where it gets really interesting. You've got this popular myth on one side, and then you've got the actual historical record on the other. This idea that Aristotle debunked Atlantis, it's not some ancient fact. Turns out, historians now call it a collective error that really only started to spread in the 1800s. So the story we've all been told about Aristotle being a skeptic, well, that might be the real fiction here. The so-called smoking gun for Aristotle's disbelief has always been this one quote: "Its inventor caused it to disappear." But here's the kicker. Aristotle never said that, not once. The quote actually comes from a geographer named Strabo, writing centuries later. He was just talking about different theories, and somehow that line got twisted and pinned on Aristotle. So yeah, the main piece of evidence against him, it just completely falls apart. So if Aristotle didn't dismiss it, what did he think? Well, to figure that out, we have to kind of become detectives. We've got to look for clues, not in what he said about Atlantis, because he never mentions it by name, but in everything else. His other writings, his general worldview, and what the people who studied with him believed. And when you do that, you find that Aristotle's own scientific theories were totally compatible with a story like Atlantis. I mean, he wrote that land and sea could literally trade places over long periods of time. He believed in giant cyclical disasters like huge floods that could wipe civilizations off the map. He even had theories about earthquakes and tsunamis. And maybe the biggest clue, he pointed out that elephants lived in the far west of Africa and in the far east in India. And he actually suggested that a landmass used to connect them. And where would that landmass have been? Right where Plato said Atlantis was. Let's just think about this for a second. Aristotle argued with Plato about everything: politics, art, the nature of reality, you name it. He was never, ever shy about calling out his old teacher when he thought he was wrong. So the fact that he's completely silent on Atlantis, that's not just a blank space, it's deafening. For a guy like Aristotle, silence doesn't mean I disagree. It's much more likely to mean I'm not sure, or even, yeah, that seems plausible. And it doesn't stop with him. Let's look at his followers. His direct successor, the guy who took over his school, Theophrastus, seems to have accepted Atlantis as a real place. A bit later, another influential thinker, Posidonius, who was a big fan of Aristotle's work, straight up said that it's better to believe the story wasn't a fabrication. It really seems like the entire school was, at a minimum, open to the idea, which strongly suggests they were just following their master's lead.
Now, to really get how the ancients saw Atlantis, we need to zoom out a bit. It wasn't just some one-off story. So for this next part, let's put Atlantis in its proper context, inside what we could call the ancient geography of the imagination.
The ancients knew their world was big, but the edges of their maps were totally blank. This was the terra incognita, the unknown land. And in these spaces, anything was possible, both amazing and terrifying things. It was a place where myth and geography weren't opposites. They actually worked together to make sense of the world.
Take, for example, the far north. They had a place called Thule. It was first written about by an explorer named Pytheas, who described it as this land of midnight sun and frozen, jelly-like seas. For the ancients, Thule was both a real destination and a mythological boundary, the Ultima Thule, which meant the absolute farthest point you could possibly imagine.
And then out to the west, kind of mirroring Atlantis, you had the Isles of the Blessed. This was a paradise where heroes went when they died. But what's so wild is that this myth got directly tied to a real place. The famous geographer Ptolemy said, "Yep, those are the Canary Islands." And he actually used them as the prime meridian, the 0-degree starting line for longitude on his world map. A myth became a fixed point for mapping the entire known world.
Okay, so let's bring it back to Atlantis for a minute. As you can see here, not everybody saw the story the same way. You had guys like Crantor, who was totally convinced it was a real historical thing. But then you had this whole other group who thought it was an allegory. And what's amazing is that they couldn't agree on what it was an allegory for. One guy thought it was about astronomy, another thought it was a war between demons, and another said it was about the human soul. The real takeaway here isn't one specific interpretation, but the fact that there was no agreement. That suggests that for a lot of people, the simplest explanation, that it was just history, was the one that made the most sense. So we have this world just filled with these incredible, legendary places. And that brings us to the most important question of all. Why? Why did the smartest people of the ancient world spend so much time talking and thinking about them? What was their purpose?
The thing is, they weren't just tall tales. You could think of them as intellectual anchors. They were paradigms or models for making sense of everything from politics and morality to the very edges of the known universe. They gave shape to the unknown. Each of these legendary places had a specific job to do. Atlantis was the ultimate warning about what happens when an empire gets too arrogant and powerful. Thule was a marker for the cold, hard physical limits of the world and human experience. And the Isles of the Blessed? That was a tangible, geographical anchor for the hope that a paradise could exist right here on Earth.
At the end of the day, the story of Atlantis stuck around because it was such a powerful metaphor for the human condition itself. This idea that we all have this divine spark, this potential for greatness, but we're also constantly in danger of decay and corruption, forever fighting against our own worst impulses.
So, let's circle all the way back to that first quote, strange, but perfectly true. For Plato and so many of the thinkers who followed him, the story's truth probably wasn't about finding it on a map with GPS coordinates. It was true because it was a map of the moral universe. It told them deep truths about civilization, about virtue, and about our place in the cosmos. And in that sense, it was as real as anything. Which kind of leads us with one last big question. If the greatest minds of the ancient world used these epic legends to map out the boundaries of their reality, what are the myths we're telling ourselves today? What stories are we using to make sense of the vast, unknown territories of our own modern world?